Coming up, the New York Football Giants' woe home struggles continue as they fall to the Cincinnati Bengals in a game that felt very much like available for victory. We break down Daniel Jones' performance, the team overall, and whether or not at 2-4, fans should still be optimistic about the season. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. We're coming in on a Monday following the New York Football Giants primetime loss to the Cincinnati Bengals. Not being able to recover from a 17-7 loss is the question on the table today. Andy, how are we, sir?
Well, considering I was at the game and I was in the stands,
right.
and it felt like it was death by 1,000 paper cuts watching that offense move the ball and struggle, I'm doing okay, Adam. I don't know. I'm not angry. I'm not mad, and I'm just disappointed. And anytime a parent tells you that they're not mad at you, they're just disappointed, it almost feels even worse when you're just disappointed in the outcome, the result, and just the overall play, especially on offense of the Giants last night.
Yeah, I mean, listen, when you only put up 7 points, obviously it's going to be a focal point for it. And then conversely, when you hold a team like the Cincinnati Bengals to only 17 points, right? I mean, that was certainly a number that you and I, when we talked about coming into this week, I said 26-24. The Giants can win this game, but they're going to need to put up points. So the fact that they were able to hold Cincinnati under 20, that was the benchmark that you put out there as well. Frustrating that you didn't find this team in a position to win this game potentially. If we think about at the highest level, Daniel Jones, and of course the quarterback play. First and foremost, you hold Joe Burrow to just 208 yards. Now, they gave up 121 on the ground. They also gave up the massive run for Joe Burrow, right? 47-yard touchdown sprint, little scamper that he went on in this game as well. But Daniel Jones, 22 of 41, 205 yards, no touchdowns in this game. Obviously, only the one score. But then you put on top of it, man, what was the classic Daniel Jones. And I wanted to frame this in the way that all quarterbacks have these moments. All quarterbacks throw interceptions like we saw Daniel Jones throw on Sunday night. The difference is Daniel Jones is not Patrick Mahomes. He's not Joe Burrow. He's not Lamar Jackson. He's not the elite quarterbacks in the league where when they make that mistake, you have such a mountain of successful moments that you can look right past it. Instead, pressure gets on him, tries to scramble, can't get away, and just tries to throw up that lame duck kind of pass. His arm gets hit. We get all of it. But it was such a pivotal moment in this game, and it was a little bit of a reality dose, I think, to anyone that was ready to clap back at the Daniel Jones slander. Good quarterback, solid quarterback, not the elite quarterback, and not the quarterback that can win games like this.
The Giants are 1-17 in primetime games under Daniel Jones. It's disastrous. It's crazy also the splits between his home and his road statistics, which is eye-opening. I think Talking Giants did a good breakdown of like the home and road on Twitter. It's just confounding. And I'm not even going to, like I said, I'm not mad or angry or like I'm almost like disconnected at this point because this is what's going to happen. You're going to see flashes from Daniel Jones in games like Seattle where you squint long enough and you're like, is he a good quarterback? Like, can we win with this style of football? And then you get quickly reminded after you start drinking a little bit of the Kool-Aid that this is how it's going to be. It is a roller coaster ride that usually ends up in disappointment. You take away that one playoff game in Minnesota, this is exactly what you end up seeing from Daniel Jones on a consistent basis. It's the frustrating, and it's not only just the mistakes, Adam, because if it was a mistake, and it was just like a one-off, like, oh, he makes one bonehead mistake a game, it's that he isn't skilled enough or isn't one of those top-tier quarterbacks to be able to make up for those mistakes. Like you said before, the mountain is just so high for him to climb because his overall play is just mediocre, so that when these critical mistakes happen, it feels like it's insurmountable for the offense.
And it's also interesting too, because one of the things, you go back and you think about the game against Seattle, as you say, Cincinnati, a defensive unit that is getting healthier, and of course getting healthier as they come into this game against the Giants, but it's still not an excuse for only putting up 7 points. The other part is You mentioned prime time, the home and away. I mean, the statistics away from Giant Stadium for Daniel Jones actually make you optimistic that maybe he does have a really good career ahead of him, just not playing here. Get him out of this stadium, and he could certainly be a more effective quarterback. But then on top of that, going into the Seattle game, there was no pressure. There was no expectation about what could this mean. Can the Giants get this win? Nobody was picking them. So then you go and you surprise Seattle and you get that dub. Now you come back, it's Sunday Night Football, you're the primetime game, the spotlight is on you, and now there is a little bit of that weight of, hey, if you win this game, you're 500. You're at least talking about this conversation about what the rest of the season can look like, and instead, you lose the game, and again, when it feels like it's the brightest, Daniel Jones certainly seems to struggle. And by the way, it's like, I mentioned that Joe Burrow stat line. Daniel Jones was 22 of 41, 205 yards, no touchdowns, the interception, got sacked a couple times. The QBR was 18.2, so the situational football was not good for him. He ran the ball 11 times for 56 yards. There's this world where you come out of a game like this, the box score doesn't have to look absolutely pristine for him, but you do have to play, as we talked about before, that error-free football, because what again was not there was a lot of the deep passes, the deep shots. You couldn't find them. Maybe we'll talk about this week a little bit of Jalen Hyatt and him getting in there. Darius Slayton, as he knocks his head to the turf. Seems like a player every week is coming down with potential concussion symptoms. So all of those things, great. But it all adds up. And to your, maybe you're right. I'm disappointed. I'm not upset. I'm not angry, but it was just unfortunate that I think this was a winnable game. We talked about it coming in. If it's a blowout, fine. But if you're in a situation to be in this game down to the wire and you can't come through, and it feels like Daniel Jones is a big proponent of that, that's what makes it more difficult. And to be fair, we'll talk about in a second, also missed field goals played a big factor in this game. Like, this isn't just Daniel Jones, but it is the overall team right now.
Well, so when we were talking about the preview, I said the most frustrating or most Giants way that they would lose is that they would contain the Bengals offense, but not be able to put up enough points.
You're right.
I said 20-17. It ends up being 17-7. Felt like kind of the exact thing that I was thinking about in my head. That would just be infuriating. But Adam, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So let's just say in a vacuum, we can swap out Daniel Jones for any other quarterback. What type of quarterback, a top X quarterback, makes this team a playoff team? Like, is it as simple as saying a top 10 quarterback makes this team a playoff team?
I don't know if it's top 10 required. I actually think what the hard part about this is, it's just a little bit of that clutch kind of gene, a little bit of that quarterback that after having a bad game can put together a really good drive. Now, again, we'll talk about the other elements of this game. I don't know where that cutoff would be, because you start to roll through it. I mean, listen, injuries aside, name the guys you wouldn't put on this team for the Giants right now and maybe feel like, hey, this could be a little bit more optimistic. I'll give you a really good example of a team. He hasn't played perfect, but he came over, changed rosters. When you look at Justin Fields in Pittsburgh right now, I don't know for sure that if you don't give me Justin Fields and his middle of the pack kind of stats, games where they run the ball more than they pass it, but the mobility, those little kind of moments that we've seen from him where you go, maybe this team is a win and a half better on average year over year relative to Daniel Jones. I think that is the biggest downside to Daniel Jones. It's not that he's not a pretty good quarterback. It's not that he can't pretty much throw it everywhere, but he can't quite get it to the deep throws when you need him to. He can't quite not make that one mistake in a clutch moment. And in big spotlight games, he definitely seems to be a QB that is way too much between the ears, as opposed to just playing free and loose and giving you a Seattle type performance.
Yeah, listen, I asked that question because I think about the games that the Giants have lost. The Minnesota game was a terrible game all around. I kind of thrown that away, and we didn't realize Minnesota was going to be as good as they have seemed to be so far. The Washington game, it felt like there were a whole host of reasons why we lost that. I don't necessarily put that much on Daniel Jones, but it feels like the Cowboys game and the Bengals game are two games that if you have a top half of the league type quarterback play, you will end up winning those games. And I think that's what's most frustrating for Giants fans, is that it's not all about Daniel Jones, but even a better Daniel Jones would still let you win some of these games. Like you mentioned it, 2 missed field goals. There were more drops in this game. There were fumble opportunities that the Giants could have picked up the ball and made things happen. There was drops by the wide receivers. There was the play calling, 4 passes to start the game when you're like, can we just establish the run maybe in this game? That would have been helpful. There are a whole host of reasons why it's frustrating, and it's not all on Daniel Jones. But
That's
if
right.
he just played a little bit better, Adam, this team might actually have a winning record. That's the sad part about it.
That's the difference between the QB play and the QB position, and why whether or not they can sometimes steal you a win a couple of times throughout the year makes all the difference in the world. Let's talk about the defense. Let's talk about the positives here, because there were a ton. And I want to talk with a very specific question when it comes to one Tyrone Tracy Jr. We'll get into that next. Okay, Andy. So one thing that we do have to acknowledge here is that the defense once again put together a very strong game. I mean, my goodness, take away the scamper from Joe Burrow, and all of a sudden we're looking at this game through a very different lens. You still hold the Cincinnati Bengals team, who coming into this game, we talked about it. Go back and look at them putting up 38, 34, 33, 25, right? And we both took out that first game of the season, Patriots for them, Vikings for us. They have been a high-powered offense coming on strong. Joe Burrow coming off of 5 touchdowns. And yet you turn around and you hold him to 19 of 28 for 208 yards. You sack him 4 times. Now, the QBR is incredibly high for him. So this does relate back to defensive front strong, secondary struggling. Listen, when you have Jamar Chase, like it's going to happen. You know you have the weapon. So it did feel like that slow bleed in a lot of ways. But you got to give Azeez Ojulari some real credit here, man. He showed up in this game in replacement of Kayvon Thibodeau and looked the part and looked ready for it. Dexter Lawrence played well. Brian Burns looked absolutely dominant in all these key moments throughout this game. So I will say that on a high level, this defensive unit, underneath Shane Bowen, clearly has a system in place. There is clearly a structure, unlike maybe with Wink Martindale. You can now, because you have better depth, kind of work through and use some of your rotational pieces and be an effective defensive unit week over week, regardless of the opposition and regardless of some of the deficiencies you have on this roster.
Azeez Ojulari was great. Brian Burns was excellent in this game.
Yep.
The defense played well enough to win this football game. It just is, you don't want to pit offense, defense, special teams against each other, but the defense did their job. The defense held a high-powered, high-scoring, potent offense to 17 total points in the game. It felt like they did enough to win, and I certainly felt that way too. It is interesting to think, obviously in the Minnesota Vikings game, the defense only actually gave up, over the course of the whole season, the defense has not given up more than 21 points in any game. They are playing well, Adam. They are the bedrock and the anchor of this team. I think that, to your point, Shane Bowen's system resonates with the players. Everyone knows what their responsibilities are. And so, yes, there are going to be big plays from Jamar Chase. Yes, Joe Burrow is going to make off-platform throws and drop balls into a bucket that, like, you thought you had good coverage on. Those things are going to happen. But I walked away from that game very impressed, thinking, man, we are still going to be competitive in a lot of games for the rest of the season because our defense is going to keep us in these games.
Yeah. I will say, too, the one play, agree on all of it, right? And it's great, and it's nice to look forward and think about that. And then the continued development of maybe Deonte Banks, right? And we've been seeing, obviously, Cordell Flott out there more. And, okay, so we're mixing this in. The one key play that was frustrating was the third down when it's Joe Burrow. You mentioned off-platform throws, and he gets it to Yosivas out of Princeton, one of my players that I liked coming out of college. When he makes that play on third down, and you look at that, and there's even another one when it's Cordell Flott on Jamar Chase, and he has all the great position, and Chase is just doing the scramble drill, and he drops it in over the top. But that third down play to me was because they went with just a four-man rush, and you try to, because at times you're just going to have to trust the secondary, and you couldn't quite do it, right? The toe tap gets in, and that felt like a bit of a backbreaking moment there as well for the Giants. But overall, defensively, you love what we're seeing from the defensive front. The system makes sense. We go back to the offseason. Hey, if you get Brian Burns, that's all you get. Shane Bowen said, awesome. Now, we know they still need to improve it, but we can at least buy into the fact that this defensive front with Okereke, with McFadden, who had the punched out fumble there at the end, the Giants couldn't quite get their hands on. All of those things you look at and say, yeah, there's a lot of pieces here that this unit, which is true, I think, unlike on offense sometimes, scheme or injuries or QB play, all that stuff, you look at the defense, you go, oh, well, this unit should kind of just gradually get better and better as the year goes on, as they get more comfortable. And that has to be really exciting, not only in the short term, but long term for the Giants. Like, this looks like this is going to work for Big Blue on that side of the football. I want to ask you a question here, Andy.
Hit me with it.
So Tyrone Tracy Jr. does not come in here and blow the hinges off this game like he did a week ago. Comes on strong in the second half. It's 17 carries, it's 50 yards, it's 2.9 per clip. That's not going to, again, make you get overly excited. Did catch 6 passes for 57 yards in this game as well on 6 targets. So he was perfect receiving the ball as well. It's another game where he did not get much Eric Gray. Clearly, he is not someone that's going to be relied on here in the absence of Devin Singletary. My question to you, sir, is, are you at the point where it may be time to say Tyrone Tracy Jr. should be the lead back for the New York Football Giants? Because I am. I think that this should be his job now. And a veteran like Devin Singletary, who offers you value, offers you consistency, offers you stability, I think that he should be the support role, because there is not a big enough margin of difference between these two players on any given Sunday. And as we often talk about, the upside of Tyrone Tracy Jr. on any given Sunday, I think, is far greater than what Devin Singletary provides.
Yeah, I don't want to be a prisoner of the moment, but I feel very similar to how you do, because you watch him, and while his yards per carry was not great in this game, you mentioned 2.9, but when you watch him run the football and you see the cuts that he can make, you see the athleticism, the vision that he shows, it, to your point, it feels like there's more upside. It feels like there's a greater chance that he's going to be able to break off bigger runs, more explosive plays more frequently than Devin Singletary. And that's what the Giants offense desperately needs. Like, I keep going back and forth on this in my brain. It's like, Devin Singletary is great because he's going to get you 3 yards. He's going to fall forward. He's going to get you the tough yards that you need. But we saw last night, the Giants won the time of possession. The Giants basically had the same amount of rushing yards as the Cincinnati Bengals, and it just didn't result because there was no explosive plays. You didn't have a Joe Burrow like 50-yard big time touchdown play. You didn't have the big Jamar Chase deep ball play. The Giants need as many explosive plays as they can get, because they are not one of those teams that, like, it doesn't seem like they can methodically move down the field. If there's a penalty or a hold or a false start, you just see how difficult it is for the Giants to pick up first downs. I think Tyrone Tracy, to your point, gives you a better opportunity to maybe make up for some of those misses.
And that one explosive play to Darius Slayton that ended up getting brought back, that was the 30-30. I mean, we talk about these key moments, and sometimes when you and I come in on these game reactions, it does feel like you get the half day removed from it and you can take that breath and it becomes much more global. But on the micro level, that was the one play. And by the way, and Daniel Jones made the one pass, right? Not the other third down plays where he was kind of throwing the ball behind Darius Slayton and not giving him a chance to catch it and allowing Cincinnati Bengals defenders to bat those balls away. No, he made that one throw. And it is the reminder that on a high level, it's not always, as we said, not just Daniel Jones, it's everybody, but it's a team that lives on those razor thin margins. So for Tyrone Tracy Jr., he's just showing it, man. He plays a little bit of an edge. Every time he gets those first downs, he wants to let that other team know that he's getting them. I would make that transition here just because you're at a point now, which we'll talk about in a second, of going one way or the other with this season. And I think you and I have always talked about the balance of having veterans and then also developing the young talent that is going to be a part of this team going forward. When we look at the 2-4 record, Andy, and by the way, coming out of this game, I should remind her, because you mentioned it, we were doing the preview, I said, you can't expect the Giants to win the time of possession battle at such a margin like they did against Seattle. Well, guess what? 34 minutes. 34-26. They did that, actually. And all the other key categories matched them in total yardage, matched them 11 total drives for each team here, right? A measly 4.2 yards per play is going to slow you down a little bit. But all of these categories were there, including, by the way, when you go into penalties, the Giants took, and this is how you know how razor thin the margins are. They took just 2 penalties for 9 yards, 6 for 67 for the Cincinnati Bengals. So there were a lot of things that helped them, right? There were a lot of things that worked in the Giants' favor here, and yet they come up just getting a touchdown and losing this game. But when we got through that quarter of the season, and now we're talking about 6 games. So, I mean, oddly enough, we are actually at the third down to third of the way through the year here on a 17-game season. Where do you stand, Andy? Are you optimistic about this team going forward? Because it's a hard thing for me to try to remedy, because you're going to be, by the way, at home, where you're now 0-3 on the season against the Philadelphia Eagles next week. Then you go to Pittsburgh. No matter what, that's a good defense, and that's where I think the real concerns can sometimes lie for this team, if you can only put up 7 against Cincinnati. And then you're going to come home for a big 3-game homestand where they can't win right now: Commanders, Panthers, Bucks. do you at 2-6 feel like this team can still win football games, that we can be looking here a few weeks from now and saying, oh, they're 6-8, then maybe just, a win away from still being in some type of conversation for wild card football?
Well, it
And then
depends on.
sorry, let me take wild card football off. Just winning football week to week. We don't even need to talk about that type of things. I know that makes it sound very different than what I'm asking. Can this team
Yes.
win football games and be competitive?
I think the question of am I optimistic?
Yes.
That would depend on what your expectations are for the rest of the season. Are
Sure.
the expectations that the Giants can be a competitive football team? I think yes. I still think that the Giants are a couple plays away in some of these games from flipping the script and having the ball bounce their way. Now, it happens to good quarterbacks more often than bad quarterbacks,
That's right.
and they make their own luck.
That's right.
What I think is you're going to see, and I try not to be a prisoner of the moment. You are going to see a Giants team go play with their hair on fire against the Eagles. Now, we may be without Andrew Thomas. We may be without
Yeah.
Brian Burns. We don't know if Malik Neighbors is coming back. We don't know the health of Darius Slayton. Obviously, he got a little dinged up. There's a lot of
Kayvon
issues,
Thibodeau.
but it feels like, and this is just the I keep saying, like, what would be typical Giants? Like, what would be like the most infuriating thing? It would
You
be
were
to
going
go
to
out
have your
and
heart ripped out a week ago against Seattle, but then they totally flipped it on you and pulled you back in. You
so if
bought
the
in, you were
Giants
willing to buy in for Sunday Night Football, and then got totally kicked in the plums when they can't beat the Cincinnati Bengals. Yeah.
right, so now you're like, if you're like, I'm all the way out. Daniel Jones thinks this team can never win another game, and they
Yeah.
go up against Philadelphia and they win a division game at home. It's going to suck you back in. So I think the Giants are going to be competitive, but the Giants are not a great team. The Giants are good in certain areas. I think they play great defense that we mentioned before,
Yeah.
but you don't expect them to beat the upper echelon teams in the league. They're not a top 12 team in the league. They're not a wild card team. They're just like better than the bottom 5 teams, not as good as the top 12 to 15 teams in the league. And that's a really tough spot to be. And Adam, if the Giants win 6 games, 7 games this year, it feels like you're kind of in no man's land where you need to make a whole host of really tough decisions about the quarterback, the coach, the GM, and basically player evaluation all throughout this team, especially on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, oddly enough, I think I'm gonna be. I think over the next couple of weeks, and record will always matter. But I'm not too off from really being cemented in the idea the coaching staff is fine. This coaching staff is. I don't mean fine as in it's adequate. As in Brian Dable is doing the job. Shane Bowen is doing the job. I believe in what they're doing, and it just does come down to lack of personnel in key areas, and then the performance, obviously, of the quarterback position and what that looks like for them. When I talk about being optimistic, I came in this year saying the Giants could go 8-9. At some point, it's not about a game like against Seattle, where from basically the kickoff, you thought, oh, the Giants are the better team today. Today, they're the better team. They can go win this football game, as opposed to some of those ones you talked about, Andy, not having a kicker in certain games against the Commanders, right? Looking at that Dallas game and saying, were we like really not capable of winning this game? It's can you steal one of those games? I don't think they've stolen a game yet this season. Seattle's not a steal. It's we played better. We won that football game. They're going to need to do that at some point. Be in a game where it feels kind of muddled and you say coin flip. Okay, the other team's better on paper. They should win it. And somehow you end up winning it. And maybe that would have happened if we had 2 made field goals over the course of the game against the Cincinnati Bengals. Maybe you would have grabbed that fumble that would have changed the tide of things, right? So there's those little kind of moments that I look at, but you have to start getting some of those. I don't know if the Eagles is that game or if Pittsburgh's going to be that game. But right now, I look across that schedule and I can grab out at least 3 where I say, oh, these are wins here, maybe a 4th one, right? So I can still see them getting to 6 or 7, maybe. But to get that 7th or 8th win, to think you can get to 500, you need to be able to show me that you can steal games when you're not playing at your absolute peak. The other thing is here, just from a global level, which we'll talk more in depth, is peekaboo. The NFC North has 4 wins as its worst record in that division right now. That is such a massive factor in any optimism around this season. Again, that little weird, oh, could they ever be in the conversation for wild card? No, they can't, because there's a handful of teams in the NFC that are clearly very good and very dominant, and they would have needed to and will need to win a handful of unexpected games in order to get across that line. So I'm still optimistic on what this season is, Andy, overall, because the team is playing better. Remember, Seattle, that's a scoop and score for the defense. They've held opposing teams in the last 4 games to 18 or fewer points defensively. And there's some good offenses in there. So there's no reason they can't be in it. I think the questions we'll ask maybe this week are, should the Giants be in it to the tune of pursuing players at the deadline versus taking calls? That's where we're starting to get here. And all of a sudden, that's week 6, baby. Like we're now into the last kind of look here to make key roster decisions, and probably what we'll talk about here. But I know that's something we'll talk at a later day.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Adam,
I'm a little juiced up on caffeine, by the way, guys. I want you to know, I was away for the weekend. I didn't have coffee for like 3.5 days. So this is
I know. I was out at the stadium at midnight. You were well rested. You get to flip the TV off and just roll over and go to sleep. I'm struggling this morning. I'm struggling like the Giants struggled on offense, it feels like. But Adam, to your point, yes, I feel like week 6, we're not hitting the blow it up button today. We're not saying Daniel Jones needs to be benched for Drew Lock at this point. I don't think that gives the Giants anything. But you are talking about player development, guys like Tyrone Tracy showing flashes. I think it's also a little bit of, I still think that the Giants are going to be competitive and they are going to play meaningful games over the next few weeks. Now, fast forward 3 or 4 weeks from now, if the Giants have not won any of those games, I think you and I will both agree that at that point, you're probably going to start thinking about what's best for the long-term viability and not necessarily what is the best opportunity to win the next game in front of you.
It also gets funky fast if you lose the Eagles and they get to 5-2 and you fall to 2-5. Well, all of a sudden, has a bit of a different kind of vibe to it, right? Like, so you're only 1 week away, and that's why these losses are so brutal and why we reflect back on some of those early season games, like against the Commanders, where it really would have a different complexion, because sooner or later, the sample size becomes the reality. And you can't keep saying, well, if only, if only. Talked about that coming in on the game preview. We know they could have won those games. They didn't. We know they could have won that game last night. They didn't. So now the track record says they don't win those games. But we reset, we turn the page, we talk about a division game against the Philadelphia Eagles, and we start to dive in a little bit deeper on what we think can help this team turn the tide and get those wins, injury updates, and everything else here, obviously, as the Giants are trying to battle through losing their number 1, number 2 weapons on offense, losing defensive pieces as well. You get us on YouTube, you get us on the podcast feed, you get us everywhere. Until next time, until the best times, it's Andrew Makowitz with Want, Need, and Nay, Demand the People Know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.